When it comes to editing, everyone kind of has their own personal preference, style. They like their own creative spin, maybe. And everyone's learning different ways. A lot of people are self taught through trial and error. You've got people watching a variety of YouTube videos. Maybe you're going to some kind of film program, film school. Maybe you're learning from a seasoned professional using different software. There's so many different ways to edit video content. And so I thought I'd throw my hat in the ring and show you what I like to do, again, based on my personal preferences. And hopefully there's something in here that you can apply to your own editing that'll maybe speed you up, create higher quality content. That's kind of what I'm driven by. How do I make the best videos, but also as efficiently as possible? Because when it comes to your time, time is money. And especially when you're editing, it's very easy to get bogged down in a lot of the technical details as well as the creative details, and you can spend hours. It's almost infinite the amount of time that you can apply to any one video. And if you apply that to multiple videos, you can really sink a lot of time into editing. So I'm going to go through and show you what I like to do, and hopefully there's some lessons in there for you. Here, first and foremost, I've just kind of got my sequence settings. This is the fundamental baseline for any project. You can see it's pretty standard, Ultra HD, 4K. That still, for me, is kind of my baseline. I'm not editing 1080p. I'm also not editing 6K or 8K. 4K is the standard for me, and also 24 frames per second. But of course, that could depend on the project. Now, this has been developed with working with editors in mind. So a lot of times I'm setting up the project for them and handing it off. I kind of like to do that personally just because it ensures the project is off to the best start possible using all the information that I have from the shoot rather than having someone else set up the project and maybe they make a critical mistake right at the very beginning, which is obviously not ideal. So if I'm handing a project over to an editor, I want to make sure they have my intent up front. And just as a baseline fundamental, especially with multi-camera projects, I always use the enable-disable method of editing. You can see right here, I've got it highlighted where if you right click on a clip, you can enable or disable it. This is really, really valuable. It's non-destructive editing. You can delete clips from your timeline, but if you have something synced with a camera A, camera B, C, D, E, if you have multiple cameras all stacked in sync, I think it's way, way better to enable or disable clips as you're editing because you can always go back later and pull it back in rather than deleting something outright, an entire track, for example. So this is another kind of disclaimer up front. We'll get to the meat and potatoes here in a second. But when working with proxies, I've found that attaching them can work, but in a remote style editing setup where I'm sending files to a remote editor, I think it's almost easier just to relink your main MOV footage to the proxy MP4 footage. So I'll make proxies that are really just lightweight MP4s and treat them as if they're source clips. They're original for the purposes of the remote editor or whoever it is. But sometimes Premiere gives you this weird bug where depending on if your MOV footage has, more than 2 audio channels, sometimes the MP4s don't play nice with that. And so it's just a word of warning that if you're using Adobe Premiere, which I'm using for all of this stuff, it just seems to be the most universal system to kind of play nice with everyone else. Basically, just disclaimer, when you open Premiere, it's going to say stuff's offline. If you go to relink it to the MP4s, sometimes it's going to give you this weird bug. It's no big deal. All you need to do is open up Premiere fully, meaning like you're not just opening the project fresh, but you actually have the timeline, you have everything fully open and stuff is offline, and then you go reattach it later. It's a really weird bug that catches a lot of people off guard where they say, hey, I can't relink clips because of this audio error. Just offline everything, get Premiere fully open, and then you can relink normally. That's not like a me preference. That's just dealing with Premiere's goofy bugs and quirks and workarounds. And when you're doing this, you just want to make sure you match the file properties for the file name. And you also have relink others automatically. If those things aren't checked, sometimes you will have to sit there and link clip by clip by clip by clip, which is really annoying. You obviously want to get everything automatically. And so opening, relinking, setting all this up should take minutes. It certainly shouldn't take hours. If it's taking you hours, you're doing something wrong. And this is where I would check all those settings, make sure stuff is working properly. And again, if you're running into bugs linking stuff as Premiere is opening, get it opened all the way, the full software program, completely open, see a timeline, make sure everything's offline, and then go relink from there. And you should be in a lot better luck. Now, I call this like tour, vlog, reality scenes. For my purposes, this is kind of when you're just like running around filming something. So think of a vlog as the most common way to think of it in YouTube settings. And I usually shoot that at 24 frames a second. And there's usually an A camera and B camera, and you can see the enable, disable method here. This is just kind of an example of what that could look like. Of course, it's going to vary by the content, but when I'm producing content, I'm thinking I've got these, documentary reality scenes that are unfolding in real time. It's not scripted. I don't know what's going to happen. And so I've got this content as a style of content. And then I also have what I call interviews, which is a traditional sit-down interview. It doesn't always happen, so sometimes it might just be like a musical montage or something like that. But this other type of content, which is typically slow motion footage, so shooting that 60 frames a second, you slow 60 down by 40%, down to 40% rather, I should say, to match a 24 frame timeline. And I always like to keep my sound effects attached to my B-roll, so I have natural sound effects built right in. A lot of people want to do their sound design after the fact and go download sound effects. You can totally do that, and I highly recommend it, but it's really easy if you're capturing sound in camera anyway, just to always leave your sound effects attached. Even if there's talking, you can disable it later, that's fine. But I feel like too many people, a lot of editors I've worked with over the years, struggle because they throw away all their sound from camera, and then they have to do a lot of work later just reattaching sound effects of simple stuff that may be already there. So when you're importing your footage into Premiere, for example, the easiest way I've found to sort it is just to use the frame rate. So if I'm shooting intentionally this style where I have my real-time 24 frames clips, and then I've also got this slow motion 60 frame clips, you can easily differentiate the two in your bins just by searching for the frame rate. You can conform everything to 24 manually. You can interpret the footage, but I find that it defeats the purpose because then everything looks like it's 24, even though it might have been shot at 60. So I leave everything as shot with those native frame rates, and any speed ramping or slow motion I'll do on the timeline with the speed effect. Now, one thing I should say when it comes to editing audio, I absolutely hate the pen tool for audio keyframing. Now, everyone's going to point out the exemptions, the reasons why it's so valuable. But as a general rule, I do not use the pen tool for audio keyframes. I find audio keyframes really irritating because they end up getting hidden behind edits. You can adjust audio later on, and if there's a keyframe earlier in the timeline, you can have these really weird, scaling, maybe like 10 minutes in, if you add a keyframe, well, now you have to plot from your keyframe 10 minutes earlier and take that into consideration. And you end up spending a lot of time tracking these audio keyframes inside of Premiere. And that's certainly not the way you want to do it. I use crossfades, and this is an old school trick that I picked up. I don't know if I taught myself or picked it up from someone else, but basically just fading between your audio. So certainly you can smooth out harsh cuts. So that would be like camera audio. You can see there, I've got a little 4-frame crossfade just to smooth the audio so you don't get those like weird pops and clips between your audio tracks, because that can happen if you're not fading. But also just on your music tracks, if you want something to get louder, make a cut and you can easily fade up to a higher volume clip and fade down to a lower volume clip. Way easier to adjust, change the spot, retime it, super easy, rather than tracking keyframes in Premiere. Premiere is not a program really meant for keyframing. You can do it, and a lot of people do, but I find it really irritating, especially with larger projects, tracking all those keyframes down. It can really eat away at your time very quickly. So just as in general, don't use the pen tool at all for audio keyframing. There's usually a better way you can do it with crossfading. And I think these crossfades are even better now that Premiere has made some updates to how it processes audio and how these are handled. So your mileage may vary, but for me, it's always worked, and it saved me, hours in the long run. So When it comes to editing, this is going to be a little bit more process than technical. So I'm going to show you the stages I go through in editing just to speed things up as fast as possible. So if I've got this mindset of I've got my tour and I've got my interview, these two kind of components, these two styles, obviously that all needs to be synced up as raw footage. So if you've got A camera, B camera, C camera, it doesn't really matter how many cameras you have these two components. At least that's how I approach most productions. A tour and an interview. The vlog portion and then the sit-down interview portion. This is kind of geared towards documentary style editing, but the same thing could apply to anything you're working on. Maybe a portion instead of an interview, maybe it's voiceover narration instead of a tour or vlog. Maybe it's more scripted scenes. It doesn't really matter, but almost always you're going to have two different styles, at least two different styles when it comes to editing, because you almost always want to be bouncing back and forth between two different things. Maybe it's two different characters. That could be sort of the way you approach it, where you've got your character A and then character B. But for these terms, just think of this as like documentary style, a tour or a vlog or reality, and then the sit-down interview. So I'm syncing that all up. First things first, get that sync set up. Then I go through and I cut my selects, basically the best parts. If there's junk, I don't want to look at it after the fact. So cut all that out. The quicker you get things cut down, the better and faster it is to get through it all. So I'll go through and I'll chop up the tour into different sections or different parts that are relevant based on topic. And then same thing for the interview. I'm going to chop that up into the best bits and basically get rid of anything that's bad or unusable or I don't want in the final piece, because again, I want to trim this down. Maybe I'm starting with 3 hours of footage. If I have to sit there and go through 3 hours of footage over and over and over and over again, that's really wasting my time. So trimming that down early in the process is really important, because maybe that 3 hours quickly becomes 1 hour of footage that I'm going through. And now I'm in a much better place, because no matter what, I'm not ever looking at the 3 hours again. I'm only ever looking at 1 hour. And then ideally that's down to like 30 minutes and then 15 minutes. And you just want to kind of funnel, if you imagine a funnel, you want to funnel your content down to the point where you never have to look at the raw stuff anymore. You're just looking at the best bits and you're working from that to speed yourself up. So I'm chopping it up and kind of organizing as I'm going through based on topic. And then after that, I'm color coding. So maybe topic A is purple, topic B is teal, topic C is yellow, topic D is orange or mango, topic E is blue. You get the idea, but I'm labeling and I'm color coordinating. So my tour, maybe tour portion 1 pairs nicely with interview portion 3, and then tour number 2 matches itself and doesn't really pair with anything else, but is strong enough and standalone. And then interview 1 and tour 4, because you're never shooting in order, right? Especially with this documentary reality style, things unfold. Yes, you have some structure, some loose idea and plan for the day, but after the fact, you're going to find that different parts of the tour or the vlog portion pair better with different parts of the interview, or whatever your particular project might be. So organizing based on color helps kind of connect the dots really quickly, where this part of the tour matches this part of the interview, and you can really see it visually on your timeline. So you're color coding and you know exactly what goes together as you're going through it. So then you don't have to go back and wonder, like, what was this portion? Oh, it's purple, and the purple stuff matches the other purple stuff. I know I can connect those dots. Then finally, I start structuring things out. So I've got my tour portion with my interview portion, and this is where it's very nice to put your B-roll over your interview, because usually talking head is not the most interesting thing to look at. Of course, we film it as documentarians, filmmakers, whatever you consider yourself, but the interview is there for those candid reactions. Maybe they're laughing or crying, or they're really showing emotion on their face. But for the most part, the interview is meant just as a means to capture spoken dialogue, and the video is there as like a backup. Most of the time you're going to cover it with B-roll, and that's also the best place to put in your music, because again, someone sitting there talking to you is not always the most interesting to look at or listen to, and especially if you have slow motion B-roll, that, like we were talking about earlier, music is really going to give that feeling and purpose and intent. And again, we're leaving those sound effects attached to the B-roll, so they just nest in really nicely. And then I find that these tour portions or these vlog portions can really stand on their own as more of that like nat sound, natural feeling. We don't need a lot of music there. You can add it if you like, but if you really want to speed things up, think of it this way, where you have a tour or vlog, and then we're building up to these more intentional interview portions and then slowing back down, really creating some dynamics for the viewer. So it's not one note, monotone, the same thing the whole video. We get a little bit of a roller coaster ride, and that's usually what I'm going for. And then you stitch them all together. So you've got back and forth between the tour and the interview, the tour and the interview, the tour and the interview, and you get that roller coaster dynamics. And your timeline will look more or less something like this. But again, you can really dive in deep and go as deep as you want. But on a very surface level, this is the kind of general outline I'm using for my edits. And the whole point of this, like, why are we doing it? Well, these tour scenes or vlog scenes, it's kind of like what you see is what you get. The Wizzywig mentality of it's reality. It's unfolding in real time. It's usually dialogue driven, the focus on the process, the activity, the things that are happening, the things that are unfolding in real life. And you kind of cut to the rhythm of the scene and the spoken sentences. There's not a lot of driving the content other than the content itself. This is where you can kind of explain a lot. You can educate the viewer. It's kind of very informational driven, or like the scene unfolding. If it's reality TV, it's kind of just like what's happening, what's the storyline. And you can think of it kind of like a podcast or maybe like a masterclass or reality TV, where it is the content. It stands on its own. It's very obvious what it is because it's whatever you're filming. And I like to edit out the long periods of dead air just to keep the pace going. There's something to be said for the ASMR style of content, but that kind of is the style alone. Like ASMR doesn't really mix well with other things, especially dialogue. So if you're doing something that's sound effects driven, that's its own beast. But for me, I think people talking and dialogue is the primary driver of the content, and any dead air or pauses in that content really have to have some weight to them. So maybe it's a moment of tension and suspense, and you can have a little bit of a pause. But in general, people talking, like a podcast is best when it's the back and forth and there's not a lot of silence or dead air, because it really sucks the life, sucks the pacing out of the piece. And so I apply the same mentality to video content as well. Of course, removing the ums, the ahs, the flubs, and those awkward moments whenever possible. That is editing. That's the junk we're pulling out, the filler. Sometimes it has to stay, but in general, I think it's nice to just suck out all those little filler moments whenever possible. But really, it boils down to it creates a lot of length to the content. Nowadays, there is a place for shorts, but for me, the long stuff is far more engaging, and it's really real. You know, when you have reality TV, the documentary style, it lends itself to being authentic and genuine and credible, where an interview tends to be on the other side of the equation. These interview music montages, I kind of call them, that B-roll being slow motion, 60 frames a second. It really shows the beauty of the work being done. So this is where you can flex those cinema skills, those filmmaker skills, show off your camera when you can shoot higher frame rates. It's just a nice premium feel when you have slow motion, and it really adds emotion and style and tone to a piece. So a vlog is a vlog, but if you want to kind of elevate it to that documentary filmic aspect, getting an interview, having some B-roll really breaks up the pacing from the more like tutorial process of the reality TV. It might not always be a tutorial per se, but the information, the storyline, like what's unfolding in the scenes and the tour and the vlog is broken up by this interview. We add more philosophical or inspirational layers, maybe a deeper look at the character and their mindset and what drives them. And these I like to cut to the pace of the music. So if I'm picking a high energy song, then the pacing with that B-roll is going to be a lot quicker. Where if it's a, more melodramatic, slower musical piece, maybe I'll really extend those B-roll shots. Or it can be interesting to cut opposite. You know, if it's a fast song but really slow motion, or maybe it's a slow song but with quick cuts, that's where you get to be creative and have fun with it. But I think it just adds that cinematic value beyond what a typical YouTube video might be. You get to spice it up with this interview content. And again, keeping the sound effects attached to the B-roll saves you so much time. When it's simple sound effects, even just room tone can be valuable behind music, because there's something your brain doesn't always hear it, but subconsciously you do feel it, the sound of a room. especially when it's cut up and or you're feeling the distance you are from the subject based on the sound as well. So you can even think of like a drone shot would sound different than a close-up. The sound would be louder on the close-up. So that can just naturally happen with the camera sound. And nowadays, most cameras are recording high enough quality sound that it's totally usable for the most part. I don't slow the sound down though. That adds a element where it sounds kind of strange. It sounds slow. So if you leave the sound real time, but the footage slowed down, it's a really nice, whimsical experience. And these moments are just fun, stylish, and creative. And ultimately, it adds the premium layer to the project. So here's some additional notes that I like to keep in mind. A lot of times when I'm working in the editor, I don't expect them to export. They don't usually have to color grade. A lot of editors are not the best colorists. So your mileage may vary, but I'm trying to keep that off their plate and they can focus on just editing. It should be obvious, but maybe not always clear enough for everybody. But there's a lot of like camera zooms and shaky work that like, if it's bad, if it's out of focus, just like don't even include it. Some people try and work with that stuff and it can work in certain environments where it feels like extra real and extra raw. But in general, for my work, I like to cut that stuff out just because it looks, I don't know, kind of bad, kind of amateur. And there's usually almost always something better to use instead. And really hammering home the point of just leave the sound attached. So many people grab the video clip and they forget the sound and then they have to go do all this work later just to add sound to their piece. Don't do it. Just leave it attached and use it or disable it depending on if you need it. I hate fades to blacks, cross dissolves. I think it's just so cheap and lame and just not... It takes a certain level of style to really pull off a fade to black or a cross dissolve. So in general, I say avoid it. And if you really, really know that's the effect you want, do it. But in general, don't. And don't even worry with video effects. There's so many effects in Premiere or Final Cut for that matter, or Resolve, where they introduce a lot of bugs, a lot of slowdown, and usually they're not even worth it. Sometimes people will warp stabilize or they'll do something like that and it ends up like bugging out, or when you go to export it, it says that like it still needs to be analyzed, and it's so irritating to deal with all those plugins. These days, the way I'm shooting and the footage that I'm capturing, I'm kind of envisioning they don't really need those effects at all, so the editor doesn't have to waste their time on that kind of stuff that can be processor intensive and create just so many problems, so many issues where it messes up the export, it creates glitches. You just don't even bother. It's not necessary. And another word of caution, don't use all the B-roll all the time. It's something I tend to see people do where they'll just like splatter tons and tons of B-roll right at the viewer all the time. But I kind of like to intentionally reveal new blocks of B-roll throughout the edit so it feels like a story with a beginning, middle, and end, rather than just a highlight video montage of everything. So if you can think strategically with how you pace your B-roll and what you show, you can feed the viewer new content constantly throughout the edit. So by the end of it, they're not seeing the same stuff they were seeing at the beginning. It's kind of a stylistic nuance thing, but you basically are creating a story visually as well as the actual story that's unfolding. So if you're using the same types of B-roll throughout the entire video, you're kind of numbing the viewer. It's again that monotone feeling of, man, this is just the same stuff over and over and over again. But instead, you can structure your B-roll where you're revealing new stuff throughout the edit, always keeping things fresh and changing. And ultimately, I always like to keep it simple. If you master the basics and get the fundamentals right, and you just keep the good stuff and you remove the bad stuff, you don't have to overthink it. A lot of people get caught up in editing and they try really hard to make something cool, make something good, and they try so hard they end up failing. It's really, editing to me is super simple. I cut out the bad stuff and I keep the good stuff and I rearrange it in a way that makes sense to me. And B-roll works best when the clip order tells a short little visual story. So even on a micro level, instead of random shots, build little stories. This is like a film school technique, but every shot, should pair nicely with the shot after it and before it, and have their own little order of events. So if you can tell these micro stories like the 1, 2, 3 or the ABC, it's really satisfying to watch, because now every 3 seconds or every 3 shots, a story is unfolding over and over and over and over again. So that way in the edit, not only am I watching the full story unfold from beginning, middle, and end, but even on a micro level, shot, shot, shot tells a story as well. And I personally really like that. I think it's super satisfying when you have content that works at a macro level and a micro level. And it creates that roller coaster, those dynamics of always engaging the viewer, having music and then dropping the music out, and then bring the music back in and then dropping the music out. Those types of things stylistically can be nice as flavor. Like music is a creative choice, and what kind of music you like and what kind of music you include definitely sets a vibe, it sets a tone. But don't just hammer people with music, well, especially one song the whole time, or like have this just constant music, constant B-roll, constant, if it's just like an interview, soundbite, 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 it just drones on. It becomes monotone. It becomes very flat. Even though it's high energy with lots of B-roll, lots of music, lots of soundbites, that can be exhausting and you get kind of numb to it. So I always like to drop that out and go back to something more raw, more real, more just room tone with sound bites, the sound of movement, something simple, something quaint, and it settles things in. And then that can get kind of boring too. So when you hypnotize them with that level of content, something simple, and you let that play out, the moment it starts getting boring, you start picking it back up. Okay, introduce some musical notes, some musical cues. Now we're adding some B-roll. Now we're cutting to an interview, and now it's dynamic, and we got a lot going on, and it's fresh, and with sound effects, and it's cool slow motion. And then again, that gets numb, so then you drop that out. And those roller coaster dynamics on a micro level, on a macro level, really make a final piece feel super premium, even though what you're doing is really, really simple. I don't think editing is hard. The hard part is learning the software, learning the tools, keeping stuff organized. But once you have your general fundamentals down of just how the software works, editing can be really, really easy. But I think people get bogged down. They end up looking at like all of their footage. So if you're ever in a situation where, let's say you've got 3 hours of footage or 10 hours of footage, don't look at it as the whole time. Break it up. One of my favorite things to say is the old adage, how do you eat an elephant? And the answer is just one bite at a time. It's super simple, but if you look at 10 hours of footage, that's going to feel overwhelming. It's going to feel really daunting. Like, where do I even begin? And so if you find a way to break it up, and that's why I kind of like this, the tour and the interview portion, and even having my B-roll separate and not even worrying about music until I'm there to do sound design. If you just chunk it up and you focus on just okay, let me just edit the interview, just that alone. You edit the interview and you trim that down, you get the best bits, and you just edit just the interview. It's super easy to edit an hour of footage. And then if you have another interview of just one other person, just edit just that. And then another interview of another person, edit just that. And when you break it up and you chunk it up like that, by the end, you have all these like chunks, these little bits, these like kind of think of as Lego bricks. Once you have all those and you've gone through your editing, now all the storylines start to like connect themselves, and the dots, and if you've color coded things based on topic, it all connects itself in a really satisfying way where a story just might unfold organically and you didn't even have to try. You didn't have to put in effort of thinking like, what should I put first? What should I put second? You just start laying the pieces down, putting these Lego bricks together in the way they fit best. And all of a sudden your video is like done, because you're like, okay, well now I have to add some B-roll, but that's super easy. They're talking about mountains, so I'm going to show a shot of mountains. They're talking about a lake. I'm going to show a lake. They're talking about a flower. I'm going to show a shot of a flower. The B-roll is kind of obvious. Just match what they're saying with the shots you have. And then, oh, wow, I just have to add in music and I'm basically done. That to me is the beauty of editing, where it feels hard, it feels complicated. You want to be a storyteller, and yes, there are times where you have to make hard choices of what to cut and what to keep, and you do have to think about what's the best order that this stuff can go in. But also 90% of the time, it just kind of happens. There's always a logical place to start and kind of what flows to the next. You'll even find those magical moments that just happen where it's the perfect segue. You just drop a section on the timeline, the next section, you put it next to it, and it just magically works. And in a way that's so perfect that you couldn't even plan it. And that's what I love about editing, the story kind of unfolding, that back and forth between what makes sense, what creative spin do I want to put on it, but also not fighting with it. So ultimately, it can be kind of effortless. That's my mantra. That's my underlying principle. If I'm fighting something and if it's not working and if I'm spending too long on something that's ultimately pointless, I'm doing it wrong. It should be effortless and easy. And these are the things that have gotten me to the point where it doesn't take a long time. Yeah, it takes some time. If you have 10 hours of footage, it's going to take you at least 10 hours to watch it. So realistically, it's probably going to take you like 20 hours, maybe 30 hours to process it all. But that's still like a week of work, less than. And so if you look at it that way, you can find those shortcuts, the time savings. Like one of my biggest things is just cutting out all the junk early on. So you're never watching garbage again. Trim it down quickly and efficiently up front. Focus on piece by piece. And I think if you follow some of this stuff, maybe it's helpful, maybe it's not, maybe it's a total waste of your time because I didn't teach you how to edit, but I wanted to at least share my thought process so you can understand how I edit, even though it's not how I edit because it's not specific, but it is how I edit. It's how I think about the content I'm creating. And maybe that's helpful, maybe it's not. Let me know. It would be helpful, I think, because these are the type of videos like I don't really see. Maybe other people have them and they exist, but a lot of editors I work with, everyone has their own hodgepodge style formula they've come up with. And there's a lot of people who waste a lot of time doing stuff that isn't helpful or isn't efficient. And there's always like better ways to think about it, how you approach a project, how you arrange your windows and what tools what keyboard shortcuts you use. That's all helpful. But once you learn it, it's kind of like muscle memory and it's just what your personal preference. Some of this stuff I think is a little bit more fundamental, more philosophical in how to approach an edit. And maybe that's a little bit more helpful in certain situations, but I can certainly understand why it might not be helpful at all. Your mileage may vary. Let me know what you think.